Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Baron, and welcome to some War Thunder tank analysis. So yes, this is the same gameplay that we've all seen, and if you're like me, you've seen this probably 100 times or so in your angst to get as much information on War Thunder tanks as possible. But we're going to be talking about, this is going to be an analysis of the gameplay video. What I showed you before was basically first impressions, as well as just kind of talking about what was going on as I saw it happen. But as this is analysis, we're going to go into a little more detail than I had in the past. And the first is, let's look at the HUD in the upper left corner. Now you can see the top one says gears. The second one says RPM, or revolutions per minute. And then finally we have speed, and I am assuming that it is in kilometers per hour. Now, another thing with regard to speed real quick is a lot of people were saying, hey, this KV-1 Russian heavy tank is moving rather quickly, and it was. And then a little later we'll show the Stug flip. But from what I understood, the game engine was tweaked a little bit to accommodate for this event. And basically with this event you had many people waiting in line. So you would have a targeted time of games basically lasting, I think it was between 7 and 10 minutes, something like that. Maybe even 6 to 10 minutes, short games, but enough to give people a taste of what tank gameplay would be like. So with gears, that presents another thing. A lot of people are speculating that in historical battles, and most definitely in full real battles, which so far as we know it, I think full real battles are a ways away, because much how full real battles in War Thunder planes, you have to wait till you have cockpits. You're going to have to wait for tank interiors. So I imagine that's a little far away. Now that first shot he just had on that KV-1 that he got points for, I imagine it hit the that front wheel basically in order to detrack it. I'm not sure if he detracked it or if he damaged one of the bogey wheels or something like that. And that one was just a nice explosion. But getting back to the HUD. So, likely going to have change of gears. Not really sure how the controls of that will work. But if you look on the bottom, you see that you have 3 different types of ammunition. Most likely high explosives, armor piercing, and then probably heat or HVAP, something of that nature. And there's likely going to be more ammunition types added in the future. And I'm not really sure how those ammunitions will work. I'm assuming that you can you might have a certain ammo capacity, and you could potentially select how much ammunition you want of each one. So, and then obviously they would have certain costs attributed to them. That would be my guess, but I'm not entirely sure. And then, like much how we see default rounds, and then armor basically tracer rounds or armored rounds, aircraft rounds or ground rounds. Basically with your planes you could have maybe preset selections, or I guess, and those would be more how much of a certain ammunition you have, as opposed to planes where you have alternating ammunition types within one belt. So with regard to controls, you can obviously see that you can select between those ammunition types with the select of a number key, 1, 2, or 3 right now. And if you look at later gameplay, when you're not looking at a heavy tank, you'll see a 4th option, and that calls it an artillery strike. And what we know about artillery strikes right now is that they are not available for heavy tanks. And it has also been said that it is going to be very first-person shooter-like with regard to controls. You're going to have W, A, S, and D, and that will control it. Much like you can use that to kind of tweak your performance when playing with mouse and keyboard with planes. And World of Tanks, you can use W, A, S, and D. And you can basically analogize this to basically Call of Duty and Battlefield. Both have the same control type schemes for the most part. It's just how first-person shooters on the computer go. Now, first-person shooters, as far as tanks are concerned, they're going to use very similar controls. Alright, so now we're going to talk about the nations in tanks and armored vehicles we can expect at launch, because obviously as this game develops, more and more will be added. But what we do know right now is there's going to be 4 types of vehicles in the game at launch, and possibly a 5th. The 4 most guaranteed ones: light tanks, medium tanks, heavy tanks, and tank destroyers. With the tank destroyers, we saw the Stug 3 in the IgroMir gameplay. Medium tanks, we saw T-34s, Panzer 3s, Panzer 4s. Light tanks, we saw the T-70, and for heavy tanks, we saw the KV-1. So we saw an example of each of them. Now, there are a number of different types of certain vehicles. And with regard to tank destroyers, you kind of have 2 basic types, you could say. The first is casemate type tank destroyers, which are like the Hetzer and the Stug 3, ISUs and SUs that Russia used as well. A lot of them were casemate. And what casemate means is they're completely enclosed. Their crew is completely enclosed in armor. Whereas you have things like the Hellcat, and I think it's even the Su-76 and the Bison as just some quick examples of tank destroyers that are kind of open-turreted, meaning their crew are vulnerable. And I think those will come later, because that's almost like mapping out the interior of a tank. You're going to have animations for the crew, and then effects like, if they are implemented in the future, I would imagine that your hull-mounted and coaxial-mounted machine guns will be able to do damage and hit crew members, I would think, or they would have to implement some sort of gameplay dynamic that accounts for that. So what you can expect, and what I'm predicting, is going to be the only type of tank destroyer at launch would be the casemate destroyers. Hetzers, Stugs, Su-100s, things of that nature. And now, with regard to nations, we know that the Germans and Russians will be put in at launch, and I overheard in Entek's video where he got a number of interviews with the Gaijin staff and developers that they're predicting that the next nation to be released would be the Americans. So I'm not sure if that would be in the first patch or a couple months later. You know, like which patch would it be? But we know that at launch, Germans and Russians, and then following that, more than likely, the Americans, because obviously things are subject to change. Alright, so we talked earlier about light tanks. And light tanks were designed to scout, first and foremost, as well as kind of dynamic maneuvers. But World of Tanks has a scouting gameplay intact. Now, if you look right below the plane right there, you saw a tank pop up. And a lot of people, including myself, didn't really know what was happening, because for all intents and purposes, we were told that planes were not easily seen by, they wouldn't pop up basically on the HUD, or rather they wouldn't have these indicators saying, hey, this is a tank, an enemy tank, so you can more easily target it and drop bombs on it. You basically had to do it visually, as opposed to having this text and how far it was away. You just had to basically have experience. So what is happening right now is that tank was tagged, which means a light tank saw it, and there's some kind of control where you can basically tag it, and once it is tagged, it is more visible in that it has those indicators, and planes can then see it. So why World of Tanks has their scouting system, when you're dealing with combined arms and you have planes and tanks going at it in the same battle, this kind of gives a lot. This could be used very well in squads, where you have 1 or 2 light tanks and then 2 to 3 airplanes or dive bombers, or even medium bombers in this case. So while the scouting system is likely going to be developed even more in the future, right now one of the gameplay that we saw, at least at IgroMir, and who knows whether it will be at launch or if it's something they're still testing, or we ourselves will get a beta test it, tagging is basically War Thunder's equivalent of scouting at this stage of tank development. So that's pretty cool, and you can basically think of a number of ways in which you can use this with squad mates or even as individually. Now, whether or not if you tag a plane and while it is, or excuse me, tag a tank and while it's tagged, if a friendly plane destroys it, how much of a reward is it to you? Because you're going to need a reward system, or for the most part, I think outside of those squads that really like to immerse themselves and basically role play or just kind of mop the floor, if they're okay with not getting a big score that game, other than that, most people would shy away from using light tanks and then tagging because it wouldn't be as much of a reward, which is one thing that was pretty good about World of Tanks scouting system, in that you are rewarded for scouting. Now, it's not the most enjoyable gameplay, but it is a role, and it is rewarded if you play that role accordingly. So how that will play off into War Thunder tanks is yet to be seen, but scouting so far is just tagging from what we have seen from the limited IgroMir footage that we have. Alright, so now with regard to artillery, we saw artillery played. We're going to see it again here in a moment, and we know that the KV-1, which is a heavy style tank, heavy type tank, does not have access to artillery. Only mediums and lights do. The T-34 and the Panzers also had access to it. KV-1 did not. Here this T-70 Russian light tank is calling artillery in on himself. Now you saw him go through it basically unscathed. There were some of that little red warning that shots were missing him. But basically what we saw is that the artillery wasn't very accurate. So the concerns about whether this thing could be overpowered or not, or if it's a good game mechanic, at the very least it is not completely accurate, but it does have its function, and it is an interesting gameplay mechanic that I'm thinking will likely only be implemented into arcade mode. And one of the reasons that this could be a good thing is heavy tanks are going to be rather powerful, as they were historically, and they can basically camp if they want to. Artillery kind of balances things out and gives light and medium tanks a little more hitting power against slower moving or potentially camping heavy tanks. Artillery strikes could also be used if you had a light tank scouting and you had some teammates who had artillery strikes still available to them. So the possibilities, there's a number of possibilities on this gameplay mechanic, and we've not even really been able to touch the product yet. So let me know what you think about artillery. I, for one, am kind of open to the idea so long as it's kind of limited to arcade battles. And when I say artillery, I meant that gameplay dynamic in that you can call in artillery strikes. I would love to see artillery put into the game so long as they're implemented correctly and they're kind of basically used for the targets they would have historically. Alright, so now we're going to talk about the ability of tanks to shoot down planes with their main cannons. Now, from what I have seen, I didn't see any firing of the coaxial hull-mounted machine guns at IgroMir, but we did see tanks firing at planes. So here we're going to have a Stuka, and he's going to be rather successful on this first dive bombing approach. And this kind of goes to show that these tanks weren't tagged, so they didn't have any basically indicators pop up on distance or type of tank or anything like that. They were unseen. So this Stuka's going in again, and I believe at first I thought he ran into a tree or a rock. Because of the quality of the footage, is a little difficult to tell, but basically that was a very violent shearing of that Stuka's wing, and I'm going to show it again, and I want you to listen very closely and also look at the chat, or excuse me, in the bottom right corner where it shows a kill attribution. Basically, was that Stuka shot down? Right as his tank or his wing is sheared off, you can hear the distinctive firing of a tank shot. I want to know what you guys think. Was that Stuka brought down by a tank?
Вот так вот. Уничтожил я КВ-1. Да, действительно, танки не подсвечиваются, то есть увидеть их довольно сложно. Ай-яй-яй-яй-яй. Ну давайте выберем. Это я тебя убил.
Alright, so another thing. We're seeing this IL-2 Sturmovik fly away after getting a bombing run in. And look at that shell right there. I'm going to show it again. That, I believe, is a tank trying to shoot down this Sturmovik, which is pretty awesome. And that will kind of end our discussion. Medium tanks, light tanks, heavy tanks, and tank destroyers. Now, a lot of people, including myself, are really looking forward to anti-aircraft armored vehicles. I want to know, which anti-aircraft vehicles do you want to see in the game the most? Also, there's a lot of fighters and planes, bombers, but specifically I'm interested in fighters and dive bombers, attackers that were specifically retrofitted to target tanks. I'm thinking specifically of the Hurricane with the two 40mm cannons that was used to kill German tanks in the Desert War. But there are a lot of them. A good example that we already have in the game right now is the Ju-87 Stuka with its twin 37mm cannons. Planes like that are going to be a lot of fun in the combined arms where you have tanks and planes in the same battle. I'm wondering if those will actually be used more than bombs. Which do you think you're going to use more? These heavy cannons or bombs? Or maybe a little bit of both. I cannot wait to try it all out. Anyway, I'm Baron. I hope you found this interesting, and if you have any insight that I missed, please let me know in the comments below. As always, thank you for watching. Alright, ladies and gentlemen, Baron here. So what we're about to see is some Panzer gameplay. Now, this isn't part of the footage that most everyone's seen at this point. I think it's like some 50,000 views on that video that most of us have used. The 19 minutes and 6 second gameplay. This is what happened basically before that, from my understanding.